So, for decades, we've been told that high-fat dairy is just a one-way ticket to heart disease. But today's submission explores a new Canadian study led by Professor Harvey Anderson, showing that a 3-a-day habit of full-fat dairy actually doesn't lead to weight gain or bad cholesterol, all thanks to the dairy matrix hypothesis.
Right. And honestly, this piece is already incredibly strong, well-researched, and clear. So we're skipping the basics and jumping straight into the high-level editorial refinement to make it bulletproof, starting right now with how the text sets up the scale of the evidence.
Yeah, let's dive right in.
And getting into that opening framing, the presentation of the study's parameters creates a slight mismatch with the definitive, absolute nature of the piece's headline.
I noticed that too, yeah.
Because, well, before the reader can buy into the science, they really need to trust the author's assessment of the data's weight.
Absolutely.
So the weakness here is that the piece boldly frames the high-fat dairy myth as, like, completely crashed or totally destroyed.
Like a complete and total victory.
Exactly. The language at the outset suggests this undeniable win over decades of entrenched public health guidelines. But when you actually parse the text, the underlying study relies on a relatively small sample size. I mean, it's just 74 overweight or obese adults over a brief 12-week period.
Which is a pretty tight window.
It is. So stating absolute victory based on a short-term, small-scale study, well, it leaves the argument vulnerable to skepticism from astute, critically minded readers.
But, I can kind of see the author's intent here, though. In science journalism, you're constantly competing for attention.
Oh, for sure.
Readers click because they want a clear hero and a clear villain. They want that dogma to be destroyed. So if we pull our punches and soften that language, don't we risk losing the engagement? We want that strong hook.
It's a completely valid tension. And you're right. They are playing the game of modern digital attention. But we have to think deeply about the psychology of the reader.
Right.
The person who consumes nutritional science is highly educated and often, pretty jaded. They've lived through the whole egg debate. Eggs are deadly. Now eggs are superfoods.
Right. They know science fluctuates.
Exactly. If an author declares a 40-year paradigm dead and buried based on a 3-month trial with 74 people, the reader's internal alarm bells just start ringing.
Yeah, it triggers that miracle cure fatigue.
Yes. They immediately flag the piece as marketing, not science. And you just lose their trust before you even get to the fascinating biology.
That's a really crucial distinction. It's the difference between capturing a quick click and actually retaining a reader.
Totally. So my suggestion here is to recalibrate that initial framing, to position the study as a compelling, provocative challenge to the status quo, rather than the final, definitive nail in the coffin.
So instead of trying to be the final word, you just become the person pointing out the crack in the foundation.
Exactly.
What does that actually look like on the page, though? What are some concrete examples?
Well, if I were editing this, I would soften the opening assertion from an absolute myth crashed to something a bit more intriguing. Like a significant crack in the low-fat paradigm.
Oh, I like that.
Right? Or you could actively acknowledge the limitations up front to build immediate trust. You could write something like, while a 12-week time frame is just a starting point, the results from these 74 individuals represent a fascinating pivot in nutritional science.
I really like that approach. Because leaning into the mystery, asking why were we wrong for so long, is actually a stronger narrative pull.
It really is.
When a myth is completely destroyed, the story's just over. But an anomaly makes you want to keep reading to find out how it works.
That is the exact psychological pivot we want. It's curiosity over verdict. It protects the credibility while keeping them hooked.
Okay, so let's say the author adjusts that framing. They lean into the mystery. The reader is now hooked. They trust the author, and they're asking, all right, how is this biological anomaly actually possible?
Right, which brings us to the core of the piece.
Yeah, exactly, which naturally leads into the material's strongest section, the physiological mechanism. The piece introduces the dairy matrix hypothesis, which elegantly explains the gap between the expected harm of saturated fats and the neutral or positive results they actually saw.
It does, but looking at that section, the introduction of the dairy matrix hypothesis offers a brilliant scientific pivot, but leaves the mechanical reality of this digestion process slightly underexplored.
Underexplored how, exactly?
Well, the weakness is that the text mentions that casein, whey, fats, and other nutrients form a complex physical structure that releases gradually, contrasting this with isolated saturated fats.
Right.
But it kind of tells rather than shows. It stops just short of painting a vivid, accessible picture of why this structural difference actually changes the body's physiological response.
Right. As a reader, I see the words complex structure, but it's just, biochemistry jargon in my head.
Exactly. It's too abstract.
I know something different is happening in the stomach, like the lipid spikes aren't happening, but I just can't visualize the mechanics of it. Why does the physical binding of these fats prevent the spike?
And to answer that, the author needs to ground the abstract biochemistry in a physical reality. My suggestion here is to use a clear, evocative analogy to contrast the digestion of an isolated saturated fat with the digestion of the whole food dairy matrix.
Okay, so we need to translate the microscopic action into a macroscopic physical object.
Precisely. To give you a concrete example of how to execute this, you might compare digesting an isolated saturated fat to a quick-burning fuel that spikes the system.
Like tossing a cup of gasoline onto a fire?
Yes, it flares up instantly. Then, contrast that by describing the dairy matrix as a natural time-release capsule.
Oh, a time-release capsule. That's good.
Right? You explain that because the proteins, the whey and the casein, physically bind the fats, the body is literally forced to dismantle the food slowly.
Which prevents those negative spikes in lipids or insulin resistance that public health officials historically feared.
Exactly. You give them the image of a time-release capsule, and suddenly the word matrix makes total sense.
It's not just a buzzword anymore. It's a physical barricade in the stomach.
Exactly. The abstract becomes tangible.
Reading this section, it made me think about how we process other types of foods entirely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, is the mechanism essentially like the difference between eating a whole apple versus drinking concentrated apple juice?
Wait, really? That is a fantastic parallel. Let's unpack that.
Well, if I eat a whole apple, my body has to break down the physical structure of the fruit, right? My stomach acid has to break apart the fibrous pulp, the cellular walls.
Right. It takes work.
Exactly. All of that takes hours, so the fructose hits my bloodstream at a slow, manageable trickle.
Yeah.
But if I drink the apple juice, all that structural matrix has been mechanically stripped away. It's just a liquid sugar bomb that spikes my insulin instantly, even though the core nutrient is exactly the same.
That is the exact mechanical difference we are talking about with the dairy matrix.
Right?
If the author incorporates that specific type of whole food analogy into the text, it radically strengthens the piece. Because it takes something the reader already intuitively understands, sugar and fruit, and maps it directly onto this new concept.
And it also beautifully sets up Professor Anderson's final philosophical point, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. His overarching point about not judging foods by a single isolated nutrient. The apple analogy perfectly encapsulates that philosophy.
Yeah, and once you fully grasp that slow release mechanic, once you visualize the time release capsule, your brain naturally asks the next logical question.
Which is, who actually benefits from this the most, right?
Exactly. Who actually needs a slow, steady delivery of nutrients? Which leads right into the author's conclusion. Professor Anderson points out the findings are particularly important for older adults.
Right, because they have lower energy needs but still deeply struggle to get enough protein, calcium, and vitamin D.
Right, but structurally, how does that shift feel to you?
Well, honestly, the final shift focusing heavily on older adults introduces a highly valuable practical application but feels structurally disconnected from the study's actual participant base.
Yeah, I felt a pretty jarring disconnect reading through that final paragraph myself.
The weakness here is that the conclusion pivots heavily to why high-fat dairy is crucial for aging adults. However, earlier in the text, it was firmly established that the 74 participants in this 12-week study were specifically adults dealing with overweight or obesity.
Right. I was fully invested in the obesity trial, and then suddenly I'm reading about the elderly.
Exactly. The source material doesn't explicitly bridge the gap between the studied population and the aging population, creating a slight logical jump for the reader at the very end.
It felt a little bit like walking up a staircase in the dark and misjudging the last step. Your foot just hits empty air for a second.
That cognitive jolt is exactly what we want to avoid. You have to remember the cognitive load of reading science right.
Yeah, the reader anchors their understanding to that specific group of obese participants.
Right. So my suggestion here is to explicitly bridge the findings from the study's overweight or obese sample to the physiological needs of the elderly to maintain tight narrative coherence.
So how do we lay down that track back. What are some concrete examples of that bridge?
You just need to add a specific transition sentence that connects the dots. For instance, you could write, while this particular study focused on adults managing obesity, Professor Anderson notes that the nutrient-dense, matrix-bound properties observed here are uniquely beneficial for older demographics as well.
Oh, that's clean. It acts as a hinge.
Right, it tells the reader, yes, we were talking about Group A, but the exact same mechanism applies to Group B, and here is why.
Are there any other ways to handle that ending?
Alternatively, you could broaden the conclusion entirely to focus on the overarching theme of whole foods for all adults.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and then you just use the elderly as one specific, high-impact example of this philosophy, rather than making them the sole focus of the ending.
That makes a lot of sense. It creates such a satisfying, complete narrative journey without losing the reader at the final hurdle.
Exactly.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Let's briefly recap the main takeaways of the critique today. First, we looked at calibrating the opening framing to actively acknowledge the study's size and limitations while maintaining intrigue, avoiding that absolute myth-busted language.
Right.
Second, we talked about using a time-release analogy, like the whole apple versus apple juice, to make the dairy matrix physiologically vivid instead of just biochemistry jargon.
Making it tangible.
And third, building a clear narrative bridge between the study's obese participants and the conclusions set in focus on elderly nutrition to avoid any cognitive jolts.
Implementing those structural adjustments will take a piece that is already built on a fantastic foundation of research and make it utterly compelling. I just want to offer a final word of encouragement, praising the firm grasp of the source material here. Synthesizing complex nutritional science is not, and the core of this piece is exceptionally strong.
Absolutely. We highly encourage the listener to implement these actionable suggestions and submit their revised work or, completely new materials back in for another round of feedback in the future. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next critique.